Hello friends, today I'll be reading I Survived the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, chapters 14 to the end. Row faster, Oscar, Mr. Morrow shouted, but the flaming boat was too big and moving too quickly for them to get out of the way in time. Oscar, Mr. Morrow said, can you swim? Yes, Oscar said. Good, he said, swim to shore. When you get to the other side, get yourself to the lake shore. Why was Mr. Morrow telling him this? There was no time to ask. The burning ship was closing in. Jump! Mr. Morrow cried. Oscar threw himself over the side. The cold water slapped him and burned his skin. He started swimming as fast as he could, keeping his eyes and mouth closed against the foul water. Crash! Sparks flew up all around as the flaming ship hit the rowboat, slicing it in half and setting it on fire. Oscar kept swimming. He glanced over his right shoulder, expecting to see Mr. Morrow right beside him, but he wasn't. Oscar stopped and turned, churning his legs and arms to stay afloat. Through the smoke, he saw something bobbing in the water. It was Mr. Morrow clinging to a small piece of wood and struggling to keep his head above water. Now Oscar understood why Mr. Morrow didn't think he could make it to the other side of the river. He couldn't swim. Oscar should have known. Papa couldn't swim either, even though he grew up near the ocean. Mama was one of the few people Oscar knew who could swim, and it was who had taught Oscar. Keep going, Oscar, Mr. Morrow cried. Oscar saw a huge piece of wood floating near him. He grabbed it and kicked it as hard as he could to get it to Mr. Morrow. Mr. Morrow, grab hold. Mr. Morrow looked up in surprise and relief as Oscar thrust the wood toward him. And that's when Oscar noticed that back on the south shore from where they had just escaped, the roof of the paint warehouse had caught on fire. His heart leaped in his throat. Any minute there would be a massive explosion. They had to get away, now. They both clung to the makeshift raft, kicking frantically, and then kaboom! Behind them, the paint factory exploded with a deafening blast. Oscar waited for the crush of burning wood, for flames to reach out and grab them. But instead, the force of the explosion created a wave that came up behind them. It propelled them forward, out of the fire's reach, toward the safety of the North Shore. They landed with a thud on the muddy riverbank. Oscar looked back, amazed to see that the river itself was now on fire. He could barely believe they had made it, yet he felt little relief. Oscar stared over the flaming river. The entire south side of the city was in the grip of fire and smoke. And somewhere in the middle of it all were Jenny and Bruno. Oscar told Mr. Morrow all about them as they trudged away from the river. Mr. Morrow listened closely, and Oscar sensed that he was using Oscar's word to paint a picture of Bruno and Jenny in his mind. We'll find them, Oscar, he said. He kept saying. I found you, didn't I? But the search for Jenny and Bruno would have to wait, because once again, Oscar and Mr. Morrow found themselves in a fight for their lives. They kept trying to get back to Mr. Morrow's house, but the wind grew stronger and stronger, sweeping ferocious fires all through the north side of the river. Entire blocks burned within minutes. Flames chased after Oscar and Mr. Morrow. Each time they thought they were safe, a new fire would erupt, and they were on the run again. Their last hope was Lake Michigan, which stretched out to the east of the city. As the fires closed in behind them, they waded into the freezing water, ready to duck under if the flames attacked. There were hundreds of people all around them, and the crowd grew to the thousands as the night wore on. There were entire families with their horses and their wagons, piled high with furniture, fancy ladies in their ruffled dresses and jewels. Children who had been separated from their parents. They all stood gasping in the smoky air, shivering in the freezing water. The hours crept by. The sun came up. And still the fires raged out of control. It would be another endless day before finally the fires began to tire. When the wind lost their fury, when it was finally safe enough to wade out of the freezing water. It took hours more for Oscar and Mr. Morrow to make their way back to his house in the pouring rain. They were numb with cold and shock, miserable with thirst, and wheezing in the smoky air. But finally, they made it to Mr. Morrow's stone house, one of the few houses still standing. And there, on the porch, was Mama. Oscar got the idea that she'd been standing there for days. She sprinted off the porch and into the drenching rain to meet them. Her face was as pale as bone. Oscar ran to her, throwing himself into her arms. They fell to their knees, their tears mixing with the raindrops that put out the last flickering flames of Chicago's fire. Chapter 15. 8 days later, October 18th, 5:30 p.m., Mr. Morrow's house, Belden Avenue, Chicago. The day was bright and clear. Oscar stood in Mr. Morrow's studio. Mr. Morrow had been right. This was Oscar's favorite room in the house. He liked the view of the lake in the distance. But best of all were Mr. Morrow's paintings that he lined the wall and crowded the shelves. Oscar's favorites, of course, were 4 paintings that Mr. Morrow had created of the farm and castle. Oscar came up here every day to look at them. Voices drifted from the kitchen, along with the scent of baking cookies. Oscar breathed deep, wanting to take in the sweet smells. Finally, he could take a breath without doubling over into a coughing fit. His lungs were healing now, his burns and cuts scabbing over. But he couldn't shake the nightmares that haunted him every night. It was always the same, how he'd wake up shouting 2 words over and over. Jenny, Bruno. Oscar would sit in bed, his heart hammering, tears streaming down his cheeks, as he thought of them, lost and alone in the burning city. The search for Jenny and Bruno had started the morning of Oscar and Mr. Morrow got back to the house. Dozens of Mr. Morrow's friends helped them. They scoured the lakefront where thousands of people were living in makeshift tents. They searched Lincoln Park, which was packed with thousands more. Day after day, they all searched, but there was no sign of Jenny and Bruno. And there were moments when Oscar feared the worst. Have hope, Mr. Morrow kept saying. But it was hard to have hope when all Oscar could see in any direction was smoldering ruins. Hundreds of people were dead, and 4 miles of the city had burned to the ground. As they walked through the streets, Mr. Morrow kept his arm around Oscar's shoulders. He pointed to men carting away wagon loads of wreckage, at the new shacks popping up on still smoldering lots. Mr. Morrow reminded Oscar of Papa, that day in the ruined forest, just as Papa had seen those little green shoots popping through the ash. Mr. Morrow already saw signs that Chicago would be rebuilt. And then Mr. Morrow had the idea of drawing Jenny and Bruno's picture and having it printed in the newspaper. Oscar described their faces, and Mr. Morrow's pencil brought them to life. The picture was printed in the Chicago Tribune, along with an ad. Mr. Charles Morrow and the Chicago police seek information about 2 missing children, Jenny, approximately 9, and Bruno, approximately 3. Oscar had insisted that Mr. Morrow add one more detail to the picture, the battered purple lady's hat on Bruno's head. The very next day, the police received a tip from a woman on the city's west side, in a neighborhood that hadn't been burned. The woman had always been suspicious of one of her neighbors. The man lived alone, but rough-looking boys were always showing up at odd hours, often carrying large sacks and suitcases through the back door of the house. The woman was reading the newspaper, and Mr. Morrow's drawing caught her eye. She'd seen 2 kids in the front of the neighborhood house just that morning. Should she have looked twice? Except for something very strange about the boy. The purple lady's hat on his head. Oscar had been up here in the studio, standing in this exact spot, when he had heard the clatter of hooves outside. He looked out the window, and there was Joseph's cab, pulling by the faithful old nag. Oscar figured it was more of Mr. Morrow's friends coming to stay. Mr. Morrow and Papa kept the door wide open to anyone who needed a bed or a meal, and the house was overflowing. Oscar had turned away from the window, but then he heard a croaking voice shouting up to him. "Oscar!" He looked out the window, and his heart was just about to burst apart. It was Jenny and Bruno. They were ragged and dusty, but all in one piece. Oscar's knees momentarily went weak, and then he'd practically flown down the stairs. Oscar had scooped Bruno up and held him tight. He grabbed Jenny's hand. He could hardly believe it. They still couldn't. They were back together. For good now. Mama and Mr. Morrow made sure they all understood that. Oscar had to wait until later that night, after Bruno was asleep, for Jenny to tell Oscar and Mama and Mr. Morrow the whole incredible story. How they escaped the fire. How Otis had brought them to the house of a man he was obviously knew very well. It turned out this man was the gang's real leader. "What was he like?" Mama asked. "Believe it or not, he didn't act like a wicked criminal," Jenny said. "He gave us plenty to eat, and he had a very friendly smile." There's one thing about the man Jenny said she'd never forget. The man only had one ear. Oscar and Mama had stared at each other in disbelief, but it turned out to be true. The man was earless Max Kildare, and Papa had been right about the gangster still up to no good. Now Earless was in jail, where he belonged. Otis Weber and his gang had disappeared, but Jenny and Bruno would have to worry about them anymore. The police recovered thousands of dollars of silver and paintings from Kildare's house. They also found 3 suitcases. The baking smells were getting stronger, and Oscar heard pattering feet running up the stairs. Bruno burst in, Papa's badge pinned to his puffed-out chest. "Oscar," he cried, "come in. They ready." Jenny was right behind him. Her new dress was speckled with flour. She loved helping Mama in the kitchen. She and Oscar grinned at each other. Her face was bright now, her braids glossy and straight, but looking at her, Oscar knew he'd always see the same brave girl who'd led him through the flames. Bruno pulled Oscar toward the door. "Come on, Oscar." Oscar stayed behind for a minute to look at Mr. Morrow's paintings of the farm. There was the barn that had survived the fire. There were the golden wheat fields that Papa had carved out of the wild prairie. There was their little house, where Oscar and Mama and Papa had been so happy. There was the front porch, where Mama and Mr. Morrow had sat talking and laughing late into the night. And that's when it hit Oscar. He could keep his promise to Papa. Every day he could look at Mr. Morrow's paintings. He could watch over the farm from here, and he would look out these windows to catch as Chicago sprouted up again. But now it was time to go downstairs with Jenny and Bruno to join Mama and Mr. Morrow. Finally, Bruno would get his cookie. And that's the end.